The first time Jake Martinez heard the mechanical whirring above his ranch-style home in Copper Creek Estates, he figured it was just another delivery drone making its rounds through the suburban neighborhood. He barely glanced up from where he was repairing a loose board on his back deck, the Texas sun beating down on his weathered hands as he worked the screwdriver. Then his 16-year-old daughter Emma's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. "Dad, Dad, there's some creep with a drone watching us." Jake's head snapped up so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash. 20 feet away, Emma and 3 of her friends were scrambling out of the family pool, grabbing towels and covering themselves as they pointed skyward. Following their gaze, Jake's blood pressure spiked as he spotted the sleek white quadcopter hovering not 30 feet above his backyard, its camera gimbal clearly pointed down at the pool area. "Get inside, girls, now." Jake's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 20 years of running cattle before he moved his family to the suburbs. The teenagers didn't argue, they recognized that tone. The drone lingered for another few seconds as if its operator was savoring the chaos they created before slowly rotating and drifting toward the neighboring yard. Jake squinted against the sun, watching as it descended behind the perfectly manicured hedge line that separated his property from 42 Maple Grove Lane, Margaret Thornfield's house. Of course it was Margaret. Jake had only lived in Copper Creek Estates for 8 months, but that was plenty of time to become acquainted with Margaret Maggie Thornfield, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards and 3-term HOA board member. At 52, she treated the Homeowners Association rules like biblical commandments and herself as the prophet chosen to enforce them. Most neighbors had learned to avoid her steely gaze and pursed lips, but Jake had made the mistake of thinking his rural background would help him fly under her radar. He'd been wrong. Dead wrong. It started with a violation notice about his grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. Then came the complaint about his pickup truck being parked in his own driveway for more than the aesthetically acceptable time limit of 24 hours. Last week, she dinged him for leaving his garbage cans visible from the street for 30 minutes past the pickup deadline. But this crossed every line Jake had ever drawn in the sand. He strode across his yard with the purposeful gait of a man who spent years chasing down wayward cattle, his boots thudding against the street Augustine grass that Margaret apparently found acceptable this week. The late September heat made his work shirt stick to his back, but his anger burned hotter than the Texas sun. Margaret was in her pristine backyard, carefully placing the drone on a folding table next to what looked like a tablet displaying live feed footage. She wore her usual uniform, pressed khaki pants, a polo shirt with a Copper Creek Estates logo, and an expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons since breakfast. "Afternoon, Margaret." Jake's voice was deceptively calm as he approached the 6-foot privacy fence that separated their properties. She looked up with the satisfied smile of a cat who just cornered a particularly slow mouse. "Hello, Jake. I was just conducting a routine neighborhood safety inspection." "Safety inspection." Jake repeated the words slowly, tasting their absurdity. "With a drone, hovering over my pool, while teenage girls were swimming." Margaret's chin lifted in defiance. "I'm documenting potential HOA violations and ensuring compliance with community standards. It's perfectly within my rights as an elected board member." "And what violations were you documenting exactly?" She consulted her tablet with theatrical precision. "Well, for starters, your pool furniture appears to be the wrong shade of beige according to the approved color palette, and I noticed some pool equipment that may not be properly screened from view." Jake gripped the fence post so hard his knuckles went white. In his ranching days, he'd dealt with plenty of predators, coyotes, wild hogs, the occasional mountain lion, but none of them had ever made his skin crawl quite like the woman standing 10 feet away, clutching her little spy gadget like it was a badge of honor. "Let me make something crystal clear, Margaret," Jake said, his voice dropping to the low rumble that used to make ranch hands pay attention. "If I see that drone over my property again, especially when my daughter is outside, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." Margaret's smile widened. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Martinez? Because threats against HOA board members are taken very seriously. I hate to have to file an incident report." Jake stared at her for a long moment, taking in her self-satisfied expression and the way she held her tablet like a shield. In that instant, he realized something important. Margaret Thornfield might think she was the apex predator in this suburban ecosystem, but she'd never tangled with someone who actually knew what real predators looked like. And more importantly, she'd never dealt with someone who knew how to handle them. "No threat, Margaret," Jake said finally, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was pure Texas politeness wrapped around a core of tempered steel. "Just sharing some neighborly advice." As he walked back toward his house, Jake's mind was already working. Margaret wanted to play games, fine, but she was about to learn that some games had consequences she'd never considered. Behind him, he heard the whir of the drone spinning up again. The violation notice appeared in Jake's mailbox the next morning like a rattlesnake coiled and ready to strike. 3 separate infractions, each typed in Margaret's precise, unforgiving font. Failure to maintain approved pool area aesthetics, improper screening of mechanical equipment, and his personal favorite, creating a hostile environment toward HOA personnel. Jake stared at the papers over his morning coffee, Emma reading over his shoulder as she grabbed a piece of toast. Hostile environment? Emma snorted. You barely raise your voice. That's not the point, sweetheart. Jake folded the notices and tucked them into his shirt pocket. This is about control. She's trying to establish dominance through paperwork. It looks like a tactic he'd seen before, back when corporate developers had tried to muscle small ranchers out of their land. Death by 1,000 cuts, buried under bureaucratic nonsense until you either gave up or made a mistake they could exploit. But Margaret had made one crucial error in her calculations. She picked a fight with someone who spent 2 decades dealing with government inspectors, environmental regulators, and agricultural bureaucrats. Jake knew how to play the paper game. He spent his lunch break at the county clerk's office, pulling records on drone regulations, privacy laws, and HOA governing documents. What he discovered made him smile for the first time in 24 hours. Texas had some of the strictest drone privacy laws in the nation. Flying over private property below 400 feet without consent, that was a Class C misdemeanor. Recording individuals on private property without permission, that could escalate to invasion of privacy charges, and the real kicker, HOA authority didn't override state law. That evening, Jake drafted 3 letters, one to Margaret, one to the HOA board, and one to the local sheriff's office. He kept them factual, precise, and polite, exactly the way he'd learned to handle livestock inspectors who got too big for their britches. Margaret's response came within hours, hand-delivered by her husband Carl, a soft-spoken man who looked like he'd been apologizing for his wife's behavior for the better part of 3 decades. She wants you to know, Carl said quietly, standing awkwardly on Jake's front porch, that she's consulted with the HOA's legal counsel. Her activities are completely within the scope of her board responsibilities. Jake accepted the envelope with a nod. Tell Margaret I appreciate her diligence. And Carl, you might want to suggest she double-check those state statutes I referenced in my letter. The next morning brought 2 more violation notices. His truck was parked aggressively in his driveway, and his garden hose had been left visible from the street for an aesthetically unacceptable duration. Margaret was escalating, and Jake could practically feel her frustration radiating from across the hedge line. But it was the 3rd day that really showed her true colors. Jake was in his garage, organizing tools and thinking about the ranch he'd left behind when he heard the familiar whirring overhead. He stepped outside to see Margaret's drone making slow, deliberate passes over his property, not just hovering this time, but conducting what looked like a systematic survey. Through his kitchen window, Jake could see Emma doing homework at the dining room table. The drone's camera was angled to capture a clear view through the window. That did it. Jake walked to his property line and called out to Margaret, who was standing in her backyard with her tablet, looking like a general commanding troops from a safe distance. Margaret, that drone needs to come down. Now. She didn't even look up from her screen. I'm conducting a legitimate inspection of potential code violations. Your window coverings don't meet the community standards for uniformity. You're filming my daughter through our windows. I'm documenting non-compliance with established neighborhood aesthetics protocols. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten years ago when he found coyotes stalking his calves. It was the recognition of a predator that had moved beyond opportunistic hunting into something more deliberate and dangerous. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying across the yard with a kind of clarity that made his words impossible to ignore. I'm going to say this once more. Bring that drone down, or I will. For the first time, she looked directly at him, and Jake saw something in her eyes that surprised him. Not fear. She was too arrogant for that. It was excitement. She was enjoying this. Mr. Martinez, she said, her voice loud enough to carry to the other neighbors who were starting to peer over fences and through windows, you're exhibiting aggressive and threatening behavior toward an elected HOA official. I'm documenting this incident for potential legal action. The drone continued its slow circles overhead, its camera now pointed directly at Jake. He stood there for a long moment, watching the machine hover above his property like a mechanical vulture. Around the neighborhood, he could see curtains twitching and neighbors gathering on their porches. Word would spread quickly. Margaret was making sure of that. But as Jake looked up at that drone, something clicked into place in his mind. He'd been thinking about this all wrong. Margaret wasn't just some suburban busybody with too much time on her hands. She was a predator, pure and simple, and she found her hunting ground in the tangled web of HOA regulations and neighborhood social dynamics. The thing about predators, though, was that they usually picked on what they perceived as easy prey. They relied on their victims being intimidated by the system, too overwhelmed or isolated to fight back effectively. Margaret had made another miscalculation. Jake wasn't prey. He touched the brim of his hat in another one of those polite gestures that his neighbors were starting to recognize, turned and walked back into his garage. But instead of going inside, he reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Sheriff's Department, Deputy Rodriguez speaking. Hello, Deputy. This is Jake Martinez out in Copper Creek Estates. I'd like to file a complaint about illegal drone surveillance on my property. Through his garage, Jake could see Margaret's drone still circling overhead. But now, instead of feeling frustrated, he felt something else entirely. He felt like a rancher who'd just figured out exactly how to handle his coyote problem. The drone stayed up for another 10 minutes before finally returning to Margaret's yard. But Jake wasn't worried about that anymore. He had bigger plans now, and they involved giving Margaret Thornfield a masterclass in what happened when suburban predators bit off more than they could chew. As he watched her pack up her equipment, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Margaret thought she was playing chess, moving her pieces around the board with strategic precision. She was about to learn that Jake had been playing an entirely different game all along. Deputy Rodriguez arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his patrol car drawing curious stares from neighbors as he parked in Jake's driveway. Jake had been expecting him. Their phone conversation 2 days earlier had been professional and thorough, with the deputy explaining that drone complaints were becoming increasingly common in suburban neighborhoods. Mr. Martinez? Rodriguez was younger than Jake had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of alert eyes that suggested he took his job seriously. I'm here about your surveillance complaint. Jake led him to the backyard, where they had a clear view of Margaret's property. Right on cue, as if she'd been waiting for an audience, the familiar white drone rose from behind her hedge line. There she is, Jake said simply. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and started recording. How often does this happen? Daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Yesterday, it was positioned outside my daughter's bedroom window for 20 minutes. The deputy's expression hardened. Your daughter's how old? 16. Rodriguez made a note on his pad and continued filming as the drone made its methodical passes over Jake's property. After 5 minutes, he walked to the fence line. Ma'am, he called out. Police. I need you to bring that aircraft down immediately. The drone hesitated in its flight pattern, hovering uncertainly before slowly descending behind Margaret's hedge. A moment later, Margaret herself appeared, flanked by Carl and another woman Jake didn't recognize, probably the HOA lawyer she'd mentioned. Officer on Margaret Thornfield, elected member of the Copper Creek Estates HOA board. I was conducting a routine compliance inspection. Ma'am, you're operating an unmanned aircraft over private property without the owner's consent, and you're recording residents without permission. Both of those are violations of state law. The lawyer stepped forward. Officer Mrs. Thornfield is acting within her authority as an HOA representative. The covenants clearly state, the covenants don't override Texas Penal Code. Rodriguez interrupted. Section 423.003 specifically addresses surveillance by drone. This is a Class C misdemeanor, potentially escalating to invasion of privacy charges. Jake watched Margaret's face cycle through several emotions, surprise, anger, and finally a calculating look that he'd learned to recognize. I'll need to consult with our legal team, she said finally. You do that. But ma'am, if I get another complaint about unauthorized drone flights over this property, you'll be looking at criminal charges. After the deputy left, Jake felt cautiously optimistic. Maybe the official warning would be enough to end Margaret's aerial surveillance campaign. He was wrong. Emma's 16th birthday party was scheduled for the following Saturday, just a small gathering with 8 of her closest friends for an afternoon pool party. Jake had spent the week making sure everything was perfect. New pool floats, a playlist of Emma's favorite songs, and enough snacks to feed a small army. The girls arrived around noon, chattering and laughing as they changed into swimsuits and claimed spots around the pool. Jake retreated to the kitchen, giving them space while keeping an eye on things through the window. It was exactly the kind of normal, happy teenage moment he wanted to give Emma after the stress of the move. At 12:47 p.m., the mechanical whirring started again. Jake looked up to see Margaret's drone rising over the hedge line, but this time it wasn't alone. She apparently upgraded her surveillance operation, 2 drones now, one hovering directly over the pool area and another positioned to capture the patio where the girls had left their bags and cover-ups. The effect on the party was immediate and devastating. Oh my God, it's that creepy drone again. One of Emma's friends shrieked, diving underwater to hide. Is someone recording us? Another girl cried, grabbing a towel and covering herself. Within seconds, all 8 girls were out of the pool, scrambling for towels and cover-ups, their happy chatter replaced by embarrassed whispers and nervous glances skyward. Emma stood in the middle of the chaos, tears of frustration streaming down her face. Dad, she called out, her voice breaking. Make it stop. Jake was already moving his phone in his hand as he speed-dialed Rodriguez's number, but the deputy was probably out on patrol, and this was happening right now. He strode to the fence line, his patience finally exhausted. "Margaret." His voice carried the kind of authority that had once stopped charging bulls in their tracks. "Get those drones down now, or I'm calling this in as harassment of minors." Margaret appeared in her backyard, tablet in hand, looking smugly satisfied with the chaos she created. "I'm documenting a large social gathering that may be in violation of noise ordinances and capacity restrictions," she called back. "This is illegitimate. You just ruined my daughter's birthday party." Jake interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "Those girls are 16 years old and you're filming them in swimsuits." "I'm performing my duties as an elected HOA representative," Margaret replied, but Jake could hear the defensive note creeping into her voice. "No," Jake said, pulling out his phone to record the encounter. "You're a middle-aged woman using surveillance equipment to film teenage girls at a pool party. Let's see how that plays with the sheriff's department." For the first time since this whole mess started, Margaret's confident expression wavered. The drones continued their lazy circles overhead, but Jake could see her calculating, weighing the optics of the situation. "The HOA has the authority to monitor compliance with community standards," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Then monitor away," Jake replied. "But if those drones aren't gone in 60 seconds, I'm filing charges for harassment and creating a public disturbance. And Margaret, I've got 8 teenage witnesses and their parents' phone numbers." The standoff lasted exactly 43 seconds before the drones began their descent. But the damage was already done. Emma's party was effectively over, the girls too shaken and embarrassed to get back in the pool. They spent the rest of the afternoon huddled in the living room, casting nervous glances toward the windows. That evening, after the last guest had left and Emma had gone to her room to process the day's events, Jake sat on his back porch and stared across the fence line at Margaret's house. Every window glowed with warm light, and he could see her moving around inside, probably already planning her next move. But something had shifted in Jake during those awful minutes when he'd watched his daughter's birthday party dissolve into embarrassment and fear. The careful, legal approach he'd been taking wasn't working. Margaret was too clever, too well-versed in the system's loopholes and gray areas. She escalated this conflict beyond neighborhood disputes and HOA politics. She made it personal by targeting his daughter, and she'd done it in front of witnesses who would remember this for years to come. Jake had spent most of his adult life working within systems, agricultural regulations, environmental compliance, municipal codes. He'd always been the guy who followed proper channels and respected authority. But before all that, he'd been a rancher, and ranchers understood something that suburban bureaucrats often forgot. Sometimes predators only responded to a language they understood. Margaret wanted to play psychological warfare games. Fine, but she was about to discover that she picked a fight with someone who'd learned conflict resolution in an environment where making the wrong choice could cost you everything. Jake stood up from his porch chair and walked to his garage where his old ranch equipment was stored in carefully labeled boxes. He had some planning to do, and for the first time in months, he felt like himself again. Margaret Thornfield was about to get education in ranch-style problem-solving. And unlike her HOA violations and legal threats, this lesson was going to stick. Jake spent Sunday morning in his garage sorting through equipment he hadn't touched since leaving the ranch. Most neighbors would have seen old farming supplies and outdated tools. Jake saw solutions. The motion-activated sprinkler system had been designed to keep deer away from valuable crops, but the principle was sound for other applications. The high-pressure nozzle could deliver a concentrated stream of water up to 50 feet with pinpoint accuracy. Most importantly, it was completely legal after all. A man had every right to water his own property. He spent the afternoon installing the system along his back fence line, positioning 3 sprinkler heads at strategic angles to cover the airspace above his yard. The motion sensors were calibrated to ignore birds and small objects but would activate for anything drone-sized moving at typical quadcopter speeds. Emma found him testing the water pressure as the sun began to set. "Dad, what are you building?" "Irrigation system," Jake replied, adjusting the trajectory of the mill sprinkler. "Figured it was time to take better care of the lawn." Emma wasn't fooled. She'd inherited her father's practical intelligence along with his stubborn streak. "This is about yesterday, isn't it?" Jake straightened up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Sweetheart, sometimes the right thing to do and the legal thing to do aren't exactly the same thing." "Are you going to get in trouble?" "Not if I'm careful. And your old man knows a thing or two about being careful." Monday morning brought the usual violation notice. Apparently Jake's garden hose was now positioned in an aesthetically non-compliant manner. But Margaret's drone stayed grounded, probably while she consulted with her lawyer about the deputy's warning. Tuesday was quiet too. Jake began to wonder if maybe the legal pressure had actually worked. Wednesday shattered that optimism. Jake was working in his home office when he heard Emma's voice from the backyard, sharp with frustration. Seriously, again? He looked out the window to see his daughter standing by the pool, hands on her hips, glaring skyward. The drone was back, hovering about 20 feet above the water, its camera clearly focused on Emma in her school clothes. But this time, Jake was ready. He activated the sprinkler system from the control panel he'd installed in his garage, then stepped outside to watch the show. The motion sensors had already detected the drone's presence, and all 3 sprinkler heads were tracking its movement with mechanical precision. The drone pilot, Margaret, apparently noticed something was different because the aircraft began to climb higher, moving toward the center of Jake's airspace. That's when the first sprinkler activated. The high-pressure stream caught the drone's left side, sending it spinning wildly as its gyroscopic stabilizers fought to compensate. Water cascaded off its rotors, and Jake could hear the electric motors straining against the sudden weight. Margaret, watching from her backyard, began frantically working her controller, trying to guide the damaged aircraft back to safety. But the drone was disoriented now, its sensors confused by the water and its flight systems compromised. The second sprinkler had activated as the drone drifted into its range. This stream hit the aircraft dead center, and Jake heard something crack, probably the camera gimbal or one of the rotor housings. The drone lurched sideways, losing altitude rapidly as his operator fought for control. "Come on," Jake muttered, watching the mechanical bird spiral toward Margaret's perfectly manicured rose garden. Just a little closer. The third sprinkler sealed the deal. Its stream caught the drone just as it crossed back over the fence line, sending it tumbling into Margaret's prize climbing roses with a satisfying crash of breaking plastic and the screech of thorns against metal. Jake walked to the fence line where Margaret was already surveying the wreckage of her surveillance equipment. The drone lay upside down among her roses, its rotors bent and its camera housing cracked open like an egg. "Afternoon, Margaret," Jake said pleasantly. "Looks like you got some debris in your garden." Margaret's face had gone through several color changes, red with anger, white with shock, and now settling into a mottled purple that suggested her blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. You attacked my drone." "Actually, I was watering my lawn. Can't help it if your aircraft happened to be flying through my irrigation pattern. This is destruction of property. I'm calling the police." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You do that. While you're at it, you might want to explain to Deputy Rodriguez why you were flying surveillance missions over my property after he specifically told you to stop." Margaret's lawyer friend appeared at her elbow, whispering urgently. Jake caught fragments of the conversation. Difficult to prove intent, and he was on his own property. And irrigation systems are perfectly legal. "This isn't over," Margaret said finally, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "No," Jake agreed. "I don't suppose it is. But Margaret, next time you want to play games with someone's family, you might want to make sure you know what kind of games they learned growing up." As he walked back to his house, Jake could hear Margaret arguing with her husband about insurance coverage and replacement costs. Emma was waiting for him on the back porch, trying unsuccessfully to hide her grin. "Dad, that was completely legal irrigation of my own property," Jake finished firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "Right, irrigation." Emma's eyes sparkled with mischief that reminded Jake of her mother. "Very thorough irrigation." That evening, Jake received a text from his neighbor across the street. "Best lawn watering system in the neighborhood. Where can I get one?" Word traveled fast in suburbia, especially when someone finally stood up to the neighborhood's resident tyrant. By Thursday morning, Jake had fielded calls from 6 different neighbors asking about his irrigation system and whether it was effective against other types of aerial pests. Margaret's replacement drone arrived Friday morning. Jake could see the delivery truck from his kitchen window. But the new aircraft stayed grounded probably while Margaret figured out how to navigate the legal and practical obstacles Jake had introduced to her surveillance operations. For the first time in months, Emma and her friends could use the pool without looking over their shoulders. The neighborhood had felt different too. Neighbors who'd been walking on eggshells around Margaret's constant complaints were standing a little straighter, speaking a little louder. Sometimes, Jake reflected as he adjusted his sprinkler system's sensitivity settings, the best way to deal with a predator wasn't to eliminate it entirely. Sometimes you just had to teach it that some prey was too dangerous to hunt. Margaret was about to discover that her reign of suburban terror had some new limitations, and if she was smart, she'd learn to work within them. But somehow, Jake doubted she was going to be that smart. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following Tuesday evening, and Jake knew exactly who had requested it. Margaret's email had gone out to every resident in Copper Creek Estates, complete with bullet points about aggressive behavior, destruction of property, and threats to community safety. Jake arrived at the community center 15 minutes early, expecting to face a hostile crowd primed by Margaret's propaganda campaign. Instead, he found something entirely different. The parking lot was fuller than he'd ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Neighbors who'd never shown up to vote on landscaping budgets or pool maintenance schedules were streaming through the doors, and more surprisingly, many of them were greeting Jake with knowing smiles and supportive nods. "Hell of an irrigation system you got there, Jake," called out Tom Brennan from 3 houses down. "Very effective water coverage," added Susan Chen, who lived directly across from Margaret and had been on the receiving end of multiple violation notices for her non-compliant mailbox decorations. Inside the meeting room, Margaret had positioned herself at the front table with her usual arsenal of folders, tablets, and legal documents. But something was different about her demeanor. The supreme confidence that had carried her through months of neighborhood intimidation was notably absent. Board President Richard Walsh called the meeting to order, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "We're here tonight to address incidents involving drone surveillance and property damage," Walsh began carefully. "Mrs. Thornfield has requested an opportunity to present her concerns." Margaret stood, straightening her blazer with the kind of theatrical precision Jake had learned to recognize. But when she began to speak, her usual commanding tone wavered slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious problem in our community. Mr. Martinez has engaged in deliberately destructive behavior, targeting HOA surveillance equipment with what can only be described as a booby trap designed to—" "Point of order," interrupted Jake, rising from his seat in the back. "Could you clarify what you mean by HOA surveillance equipment? Because I wasn't aware the association had authorized drone monitoring of private properties." A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret's face flushed, but she pressed on. "As an elected board member, I have the authority to investigate potential violations of community standards through any reasonable means, including filming minors in swimwear," called out Carl Hendricks, whose daughter had been at Emma's ruined birthday party. The murmur became more pointed. Jake could see other parents in the crowd exchanging glances and nodding grimly. Margaret's lawyer friend whispered something urgent in her ear, but she shook her head stubbornly. "I was conducting legitimate inspections of potential code violations. Mr. Martinez destroyed expensive equipment that was being used for official HOA business." Jake stood again, pulling out his phone. "Would the board like to see the video Deputy Rodriguez took when he officially warned Mrs. Thornfield that her drone activities were violations of state law?" The room went dead quiet. Board member Patricia Vance looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. "Furthermore," Jay continued, "I'd be happy to share the sheriff's department case number for the harassment complaint I filed after Mrs. Thornfield used 2 drones to surveil teenage girls at a private pool party." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "That's not. I wasn't. The HOA has the authority to ensure compliance with—" "Ma'am," interrupted a voice from the middle of the room. Jake turned to see an older gentleman he didn't recognize, Harold Pembroke, retired attorney. "I've been reviewing the HOA covenants since this mess started, and I can't find any provision that authorizes surveillance of private property. Could you point me to the specific section you're relying on?" Margaret shuffled through her papers frantically. "The general enforcement provisions clearly state." "They state that violations can be documented and reported," Pembroke continued calmly. "They don't authorize invasion of privacy or surveillance activities that violate state law." Board President Walsh cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should focus on the property damage incident itself." "You mean the irrigation system?" Jake asked innocently. "I'd be happy to discuss my lawn watering setup. It's been very effective at maintaining proper moisture levels in my yard." The crowd rippled with barely suppressed laughter. Margaret's face had progressed from red to a deep purple that suggested her blood pressure was approaching critical levels. "He deliberately targeted my drone. This was premeditated destruction of property." Jake shrugged. "I installed a sprinkler system on my own property to water my own lawn. If someone chooses to fly aircraft through the irrigation pattern, that's not really my responsibility, is it?" More laughter from the crowd, and Jake could see several neighbors pulling out their phones to record the exchange. The timing was suspicious. Margaret pressed on, her voice rising toward hysteria. "The system activated exactly when my equipment was conducting an inspection." "Motion-activated sprinklers are pretty standard for lawn care," Jake replied reasonably. "They're designed to turn on when they detect movement. Kind of the whole point." Harold Pembroke raised his hand again. "Mrs. Thornfield, are you saying you were operating an aircraft over Mr. Martinez's property without his permission at the time this irrigation system activated?" Margaret realized the trap too late. "I was. The HOA has the authority to." "So you were trespassing in his airspace," Pembroke continued relentlessly, "after being officially warned by law enforcement to cease such activities." The room erupted in conversation as neighbors began putting the pieces together. Margaret looked around desperately for support but found only skeptical stares and disapproving frowns. Board member Patricia Vance finally found her voice. "Margaret, I think we need to discuss limitations on your inspection activities. What limitations? I'm an elected board member. I have the responsibility to enforce community standards. You have the responsibility to follow the law, Walsh said firmly. And based on what we've heard tonight, it seems like there might be some overreach happening. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Carl Thornfield stood up slowly from his seat near the back of the room, his face carrying the weight of years of accumulated